A Spirited Exchange. Written by Jessica L. Jackson. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. I can call spirits from the vasty deep. Why, so can I, or so can any man. But will they come when you do call for them? Henry IV, Act 3, Scene 1. Prologue. October 1st, 1811. Castle Omnis, Chalfont St. Giles, Buckinghamshire. Earl Reginald St. Edmund, a tidy man slightly below average stature, and Lady Sarah, the Countess St. Edmund, a tiny woman with jolly features, entered the great hall and sat in their favourite chairs in front of a baronial-sized fireplace. This feature dwarfed them, but did not dismay them, for they had lived with it for many years. The Earl because this was his family seat, and the Countess because she had married the Earl some 35 years previous. The Earl gestured to their butler, Banning, who towered over them. He brought them glasses of Burgundy. Lady St. Edmund sipped hers, and then straightened the lacy cap adorning her iron-grey hair. Her husband smoothed his neat little beard and moustache. Anticipation sparkled in their eyes. "Now, please, Banning," the Countess ordered. "My lady," the butler said, bowing. Banning walked in his stately way to where a bronze gong of prodigious size occupied a pride-of-place position within an arched recess in the stone wall. She grinned at her husband. "I am so excited this year, even more so than usual." "As am I," he said, patting her hand. "I am delighted to perform this service for my old friend." They watched Banning take the mallet, the head wrapped in sheepskin, from the hook on the wall. He spread his feet and struck the gong a mighty blow. A deep, resonating thrum filled the great house, seeking every nook, cranny, and hidey-hole. Before the last ripple of sound died away, they came, swooping in one at a time, or in couples and groups. The Earl and his Countess smiled at their family, waving them into one of the oldest parts of their home. "Come in," Lord St. Edmund said. "Welcome, welcome." "Yes, come in. We have news," his wife cried, beaming at them. The last family member arrived, a scowl on his handsome visage. He found a place at the front of the throng, folded his arms, widened his stance, and glared at everyone around him. "Well," he demanded, "why have you called us?" He glanced about the great hall. "Since this is a family meeting, where is Percy? Has he returned to Oxford?" "No," the Earl said, shaking his head. "He has finished school, remember?" "He will be coming from London the day after tomorrow. The rest of our guests will arrive next Friday," Lady St. Edmund explained. "We are so pleased to let you know that—" "Guests?" her husband's grandmother cried, interrupting. She clapped her hands and hopped once in abject excitement. "Guests?" someone else asked, sounding surprised. "So soon?" "Is it that time already, forsooth?" another gentleman asked. "What?" their angry ancestor growled. He always seemed to feel the need to growl, much to the dismay of his family, though in truth they were well used to it. He had a gravelly voice that lent itself perfectly to growls and snarls. Too much time in battles, the rest of the family thought. "God's blood, not again." "Mind your tongue," an imposing dowager ordered, snapping her fan at him. "He is an earl. Be respectful." The angry gentleman snarled this time. "I am an earl, Earl Sebastian St. Edmund." "Me too." "So am I. As am I, and damned tedious I found it too." "Earl Thomas St. Edmund at your service." a macaroni declared unnecessarily, sweeping off his feathered hat and bowing elegantly over his hosed and shod leg. "I ain't no," a morose voice remarked. "Viscount is nothing to be ashamed of, Uncle Fred," Lady St. Edmund said soothingly. "Frederick, my lady," he reminded her. The current Earl patted the air with one hand. "Now, everyone, calm down." The hall grew quiet, though the Earl thought he heard Sebastian grumble. "Our guests will arrive on Friday, October 18th. If you remember, we always have a house party during the last 2 weeks of October. A little hunting, a little archery, a little matchmaking." Sebastian moaned and clutched his head with both hands. "Spending all our money," Frederick stated gloomily. Ignoring Uncle Fred, Lady St. Edmund said, "We are inviting only 7 young people this year." The others sighed or cheered, according to their dispositions. "This means there will not be enough guests to go around." "Good," Sebastian barked. He grinned with grim pleasure. Ignoring his interruption, Lady St. Edmund asked, "Who would like one?" Hands shot up into the air. She wrote their names down on a sheet of paper. She examined the list and sighed happily. "There are too many who want a guest to get one. We will choose and let you know." General moans sounded. "You may go now," the Earl said. They left slowly, talking amongst themselves. At the door, one of the stragglers stopped, turned, and she asked, "Excuse me, but will there be a ball?" "We always have one," Lady St. Edmund replied patiently. There was no use getting irritated with them for their forgetfulness. "A costume ball?" "Yes, a costume ball." "Oh, good." The Earl and the Countess waited for the last one to leave before Lady St. Edmund said, "That went rather well this year." Her husband threw up his arms. "Now you have said it." "I am not bringing bad luck our way," she stated primly. "You ought to apologize immediately." Lady St. Edmund frowned at him. "To whom?" He jabbed his thumb at his chest. "To me." She smiled and touched his hand. "I am sorry, Annie." Lord St. Edmund kissed her hand. "Of course, forgiven." Chapter 1. Longbourn House, Hertfordshire. Lizzy glanced at her father. As usual in the morning, he sorted through the mail. He riffled through the pile, setting some aside. His eyebrows bounced when he reached a certain point in the group. He abandoned the rest, and kept a card in his hand. His eyes widened in obvious pleasure, and she thought the card must be an invitation or an announcement. "What is it, Papa?" she asked. "An invitation?" He grinned at her and winked. "I must talk to your mother about it before I tell you, dearest Lizzy." "Mr. Bennet," her mamma commanded, holding out her hand. Shaking his head, he put the card into the inside pocket of his coat, and continued to examine his other correspondence. "You are an abominable tease, husband." "I acknowledge it, wife." He glanced at her, his gaze roving over her features and figure. "You always do look excellent in yellow. Not every lady can wear the colour to good effect, as you know." Her mother's cheeks pinked in obvious pleasure at his compliment. Lizzy also thought she appeared excellently turned out today. Mrs. Bennet simpered. "How sweet you are." "You must have plans," Mr. Bennet suggested, his eyebrows high. "I do. I am meeting with the Women's Auxiliary this morning about the Christmas fete." "May I ask that you spare me a few minutes after our meal is over?" he asked his wife. "In the morning room." She eyed the breast of his coat. "Certainly, good sir." Soon after they left the breakfast room, Lizzy tweaked Jane's elbow and nodded at the door. Their sister Mary had already left the room, and their 2 youngest sisters, Lydia and Kitty, were squabbling over the last scone. Lizzy pulled a reluctant Jane behind her, hurrying them across the smooth blue-veined marble floor toward the morning-room entrance. The small parlour received light from the east through windows large enough to step through. Lizzy hoped to discover what it was their father needed to talk to their mother about in private. "This is childish," Jane whispered, glancing back at her sister. "You know it is." Lizzy flapped her other hand. "Hush! You know Mamma will just tell us afterward," Jane argued, slowing down. Lizzy dropped her hand and grabbed her arm, dragging her toward the morning-room. The door had only been closed most of the way, leaving a 1-inch crack. She opened her eyes at Jane in an urging glare. "I do not wish to wait," she breathed, "and neither do you. What if Mamma does not tell us this time?" Jane shook her head, but huddled behind her just the same as they listened in to their parents' conversation. "Why only Jane, Lizzy, and Mary?" their mother was saying, annoyance in her voice. "I hate to think of how Kitty and Lydia are missing out." She heaved a sigh. "And this treat will be wasted on Mary." "My dear Mrs. Bennet, no young person ever goes to one of these house parties without gaining an advantage. No one." "I do not like that we are not invited. Who is to chaperone them, I ask you?" "Lady St. Edmund will be there, of course." "And who is she, pray, when she is at home? Why have I never met these friends of yours?" "They move in different circles than we do. I know the Earl very well, I assure you. We spent time on our grand tours together. Earl St. Edmund is a distant relation," Mr. Bennet said soothingly. "I promise. They are perfectly respectable." "Is he from the side of the family that the Collins are from?" Without waiting for a reply, she stated in a pithy aside, "I still cannot believe he is your heir." "Now, Mrs. Bennet, let us not canvass that old aggravation." Lizzy nodded to herself, thankful he wanted to stop her from talking about that subject again. Their mother had been complaining about that eventuality ever since Lydia's birth. She had ended their parents' last hope to keep Longbourn away from the dratted heir, a gentleman they had yet to meet. "Very well. You know, Mr. Bennet, that there is something a little fast about a house party," their mother stated, "particularly for young unmarried ladies." Lizzy exchanged a look with Jane. "A house party?" "I trust our daughters not to go beyond the line," their father stated. Lizzy heard the forced patience in his voice. "As do I. It is not them that I worry about. I assume single gentlemen will be there as well." "Of necessity," they heard their father stand. "They are going, madam." "Even Mary?" "Especially Mary. Did you think to keep her as the companion of your old age?" he demanded. "No, I did not mean. Perhaps I have not told you this before, Mrs. Bennet, but Mary reminds me of my own dear mother. She married, and Mary will too." "Jane should not go away at this time," their mother argued, ignoring their father's comment about his mother. "There is Mr. Bingley to consider. He is quite taken with her." "Then he will be pleased to see her again when she returns." Their father let out an explosive breath. "Why are you so concerned about Jane and Lizzy? I have no concern over their ability to attract suitable husbands. However, you have spent no time or effort on your middle daughter." "She is too young." "Good Lord, woman, she will be 19 in a few months. I married you when you were 18, if you recall." "But—" "They are going, and they will take Polly with them." Their mother gasped. "Are Lydia and Kitty to go without a personal maid? Polly also helps Hill and Becky with the housekeeping. How will they manage without her?" "Your two youngest may help each other. You may hire an extra girl to help out Hill while Polly is away. There will be no difficulty, for there will be 3 less to clean up after or to feed. Your maid will assist Polly in preparing the girls' clothes for their time at Castle Omnis." "Dowling is too busy," came her hasty reply. "Mrs. Bennet," their father said in a low, warning voice. "Oh, very well," their mother said with ill grace. She took a deep breath and added another argument to the whole. "Kitty and Lydia will not like to be left out. Even more so now we have learned the militia is not to be billeted in Meryton this winter. I leave it to you to keep their disappointment under control. Good day, madam. I will go now and inform our daughters of the treat in store for them." Lizzy and Jane hastily withdrew down the corridor, taking refuge in a small room used by Mary as her personal library. Their sister looked up at their entrance, frowning in surprise. "What are you doing here?" she asked, half rising from the desk chair she used with her open walnut secretaire. "What has occurred?" Jane sank down onto a low chair upholstered in dark green velvet. Lizzy joined her in a chair that matched the first. Mary winced as Lizzy sat. "What is the matter?" Lizzy asked, glancing down at herself. "Did I get egg on my bodice?" "No, nothing," Mary said, fidgeting with her quill. She hastily set it down on the blotter. "I asked you what you are both doing here. Are you escaping from Mamma?" "No, no," Jane promised. "I know," Mary said, tucking in her chin and fixing Lizzy with a gimlet eye. "You have been eavesdropping again. I can tell. I could quote something about the danger of hearing something you should not, but I have used up all my quotes on that subject." Lizzy's shoulders relaxed. Mary's lips tightened. "Is it about that invitation Papa received?" Nodding, Lizzy began to tell her the news that so closely concerned all 3 sisters. "Yes, we had—" A knock sounded at the door. It opened, and their father poked his head in. "May I come in, Mary dear?" He noticed Lizzy and Jane. "Oh, you are both here too. Good, good." "Come in, Papa," Mary said, rising. She offered him her chair, since there was none for him. "You sit," he said, waving at her. He entered and closed the door behind him. They all noticed the invitation held in his hand. Mary perched on the edge of her chair. "How can I help you, Papa?" He handed her the invitation. "Read it, please." Mary obliged. "To Miss Jane Bennet, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, and Miss Mary Bennet. Earl St. Edmund and Countess St. Edmund request the pleasure of your company at a country house party. Pray present yourself on October 18th, 1811, at Castle Omnis for a fortnight's stay. There will be shooting, archery, bowls, and a costume ball on All Hallows Eve. Costumes for the ball will be provided. Kindly bring a personal maid. A response is gratefully requested." "Heavens!" Jane breathed. "Is this the same Lord St. Edmund you have spoken of before? The one you travelled with for a time on your grand tour?" Lizzy added, a twinkle in her eye. Her father pointed a finger at her. "You, miss, are a naughty puss." "Papa," Lizzy drawled, grinning, "you deliberately left the morning-room door open." "I did," he acknowledged, "but you could have controlled your impulse to eavesdrop." "I am not sure I could have," she admitted with a sort of grimace, "not with you acting so mysteriously." Mary waved the invitation. "Are we to go?" Jane held out her hand for the card, and Mary passed it over for her to peruse. "Yes, you are," their fond papa declared. "Your mother is not so certain you should go without us, or without her, at the very least, but I was firm." "You were?" Mary asked, her eyebrows popping up. Chuckling, he said, "Yes, you would have stared to hear me." "It is true," Lizzy said, accepting the card from Jane. He surprised even me." Mr. Bennet threw up his hands, declaring, "Verily I say unto you, no prophet is accepted in his own country." "Yes, Luke 4, verse 24, Mary said a trifle impatiently. "But, Papa, may we take Polly?" Her father gestured to Lizzy. She answered for him, "Yes, we are to take Polly." "Now, you have only 10 days to prepare. The clothes you are to take must be made ready, and I think," he said, scratching his jaw, "that this calls for a few new evening dresses." "Truly, Papa?" the girls asked in unison. This caused them to laugh. "Yes, and 2 additional gowns. The type will depend on your existing wardrobe, and whatever additional accessories, hats, furbelows, and so forth, that you decide are necessary." Jane rose. "Will Mamma not advise us, sir?" Mr. Bennet shrugged. "I expect she will. She has not been to this type of house-party before, however, so I am at your disposal should you have any questions." "Thank you, sir," Jane said, hurrying over to him and squeezing his arm. She kissed his cheek when he offered it. "I am pleased we will not be leaving immediately, else we would miss the Meryton Assembly. Mr. Bingley is to bring his sisters and a friend from London to it." "I am also pleased about that," Lizzy acknowledged. "Yes, thank you, Papa, for this treat. But where is Castle Omnis?" she asked, coming to her feet. Lizzy waved at Mary to join them. "Will we need to travel far?" "You will not. It is less than 20 miles from here. Castle Omnis is near Chalfont St. Giles, Buckinghamshire." "Will grand people be there?" Mary asked, sounding a little daunted. Lizzy noticed she glanced sideways then, as though looking at someone who was not there. The action made her appear a little odd. Oh dear, I should not wish her to be abused by strangers. "The St. Edmunds are the kindest people," he assured them. "They hold a house-party every year, inviting young, unmarried people. They have a son, Percival, Viscount Turville. He is also unmarried still." After a moment's thought, he added, "I think he is 24." "Will we know anyone?" Lizzy asked, worried more for Mary's sake than for herself and Jane. Mr. Bennet shook his head and shrugged. "I do not know." Jane glanced at her sisters first, and then at her father. "I think, Papa, that we have enough information to be going on with. There is not very much time for the modiste to complete her upcoming commissions for us. We must review our wardrobes, make a list, and sally forth." "Enjoy yourselves," their father said, and held the door open for them. Once they had passed through, he crossed the corridor to his book-room. Lizzy looked back at Mary, who dawdled. "What is it, Mary?" "It seems Papa has forgotten that I am still in mourning," she said, gesturing to her lavender dress, trimmed with dark grey ribbons. Hurrying to her side, Lizzy took both her hands in hers. "My dearest, it has been a year since Heather died. She was your closest friend, so surely you realize she would not wish you to remain in mourning for longer than a year." Mary gave a shuddering sigh. She nodded once. "You are right. I will put aside my mourning. It is time." "I am proud of you," Lizzy said, squeezing her hands. "Now, let us press on. There is plenty to do. I know you will be happier if you make a list. Shall we begin?" "I will make a list for you and Jane, too," her sister said, quickening her steps. "I will begin them immediately." Lizzy reached the stairs first. "I see Jane has gone ahead. I hope she has rung for Polly." "There is going to be so much fuss from Lydia and Kitty," Mary warned. A screech sounded from the next floor. "Ooh, that was Lydia, I warrant." "And that cry was Kitty's," Lizzy remarked grimly. Netherfield Park, Meryton, Hertfordshire. Charles Bingley held up 2 newly arrived invitation cards. Does anyone know Earl St. Edmund? Darcy looked up from his breakfast and accepted the card Charles passed across the table to him. He examined it. Their country seat is in Buckinghamshire. My father knew him at school. I have also met the Earl and his Countess at various functions. He tapped the card on the table. My invitation has come from them as well. They have a son, Charles' sister Caroline offered. Percy, Viscount Turville. Right, I know him, Charles said, looking back down at the card. It seems we have been invited to a country house party at Castle Omnis. He frowned and looked at Darcy. Omnis, Latin for everyone, right? Darcy nodded. Yes, they must have heard somehow that I would be at Netherfield. It names you specifically, Caroline. We must be there on October 18th. They mean for us to remain for a fortnight. Can you manage that, Darcy? Nodding, Darcy said, Yes, I believe so. I am curious. Are you not? Oh, yes. What about you, Caroline? Charles asked, passing the invitation to her. Will you be able to come, or do you have other social obligations? Caroline, a finely built, graceful woman, a year older than her brother, took the card and read it over. I can. You know, I think I have heard something about this couple. They are shameless matchmakers. Darcy felt his expression stiffen. Charles saw it and said, Now, Darcy, old fellow, you cannot back out now. I think it sounds like a wonderful event. Letting his expression relax, Darcy said, I will not leave you unsupported, my friend. I wonder if Miss Bennet has been invited, Charles asked, grinning. That would be beyond everything. Charles, Caroline said, waving a finger at him, I urge you not to get your hopes up. What is the chance, I ask you? Very slim, I would venture. Why? He demanded, taking the invitation back from her. The Bennets live a local life, she pointed out. They do not move in the same society as earls and countesses. His expression slumped a little. I will miss her. She will be here when we return, Darcy soothed. He knew Caroline wished to separate her brother from a lady she considered unable to increase her brother's consequence or coffers. In the meantime, we will enjoy some agreeable companionship and activity. Charles nodded, sighing in a dejected fashion, as dejected as someone with his cheerful disposition could muster. I will write to them on behalf of us all, accepting the invitations. Sprot Hall, near Sheffield, Yorkshire. What have you there, Andrew? The widow, Mrs. Sprot, asked her eldest son. She had 5 others. Andrew looked up from the card he held in one hand. The other hand held a piece of bacon. He put the unfinished bacon down on his plate, and his youngest brother, only 12, snatched it up. Andrew shook his head at him. You should be away at school, he remarked. The upperclassmen would beat such behaviour out of you. Alan grinned cheekily. Is that what happened to you? Too right, Andrew said, leaning back in his chair. I am sending you after the Christmas break, even if I have to sell one of the other brothers to get enough money for the fees. I thought you meant to keep tutoring me, Alan asked, frowning now, his grey eyes filled with worry. You know just as much as any of the teachers at any stupid school. Lessons are not the only thing you learn in school, Andrew said dryly. He and his mother exchanged glances. Ever since his father's death 3 years before, Andrew had acted like a father to his younger brothers. At 25, he felt ancient in comparison. Is it a letter from the twins? Has their ship come into port? Mrs. Sprot asked hopefully. Andrew was 7 years older than the twins. Fortunately for the family coffers, those two had joined the Navy as midshipmen a year after their father's death, under the aegis of their uncle, a rear admiral. No, mother. He looked at the card again, trying to reason out why he had received such a thing. It is an invitation. Oh, yes, to a country house party. He set the card face down on the tablecloth. I shall not go, of course. She opened her eyes wide at him. And why not? It is in Buckinghamshire, and I do not know the hosts. Who are they? Alan asked, clearly hoping to move the conversation on from his schooling. The Earl and Countess St. Edmund, Andrew said, seeing no harm in the boy knowing. His mother made a little sound of exclamation. Oh, I know the Countess, she exclaimed. I went to a seminary in Bath with her. We used to be bosom friends. We told each other all our secrets. That is a fine memory, Mother, and I see how that might be the reason I received an invitation, but I still cannot leave. They wish me to be there for a fortnight. I have too much to do here. I cannot leave it all to you and Berks. Their estate manager did his best, but he was young and diffident, too diffident by half. Just when Andrew needed advice, Burke would flush and say nothing, as though he did not value his own knowledge. It frustrated Andrew to no end. And to add to the 14-day visit, there is the travel time, 3 days each way, unless I take the mail and travel all night. She scowled prettily at him. I will not have you arrive at Castle Omnis on a mail coach. You will take a chaise. We cannot afford to hire a chaise, as you know very well, he said as gently as he could. His mother, however, was paying his reminder no attention. She had her chin up, and was unpinning the pearl and ruby brooch given to her by his father on their wedding day. Placing it on her palm, she examined it with a frown. Do you think I could get 50 guineas for this? She asked, excitement marking her voice. I think I could. Mr. Gilder was admiring it only the other day. He was standing outside his shop. Your father bought it from him, so Mr. Gilder should know its value. Andrew shook his head emphatically. You cannot sell your brooch. I certainly can, his mother claimed. It is doing nothing good pinned to my collar. I will sell it, and you can use the money for the journey, and for little gifts for the servants. Alan's lessons. I will tutor him in the classics while you are away, and then you can devote your time together to mathematics when you return. Mother, he said, sighing, do not mother me, Andrew. You are going, and that is that. And as a gift for your host, you will take a firkin of our award-winning cider. Attempting to tie his cravat, Percy Viscount Turville considered the family curse, though his parents called it a gift. He had it. The heirs always had it. The curse affected some of his other relatives, though only one of his 7 cousins ever noticed anything out of the ordinary when they visited Castle Omnis. One of his uncles and one of his 3 aunts also had the curse gift. There were cousins on his father's side of the family, of course. His mother had been a very distant cousin to his father, and when she arrived at Castle Omnis, she had been most surprised to discover she also had the family curse gift. He cast aside the cravat he had been attempting to tie in the mathematical arrangement, and took another prepared length of white silk muslin from his valet, Wilkes. The slightly stout man, 7 years older than Percy, had been his valet since the Viscount turned 16. Wilkes had joined him at Oxford, and followed him to London, where they resided in Omnis House, on Berkeley Square. Men of the Wilkes family had served the St. Edmund heirs for centuries. Banning, their current butler, was Wilkes' cousin, and Wilkes' father was the Earl's valet. Is everything prepared for our return to the family pile? Percy asked. Have all my personal debts been paid? The household expenses came out of his father's accounts. Yes, my lord, Wilkes said, gravely watching his efforts. What he saw must have satisfied him, for he set aside the other 4 prepared lengths, laying them over thick dowels in the cravat stand, a piece of walnut furniture of his own design. Percy sighed with satisfaction as he finished arranging the cravat. He held out his arm to slip into his coat. Some effort was required to finish the process, for the coat, made by Weston, and of excellent cut, fitted snugly. "I do not know why I am going to the Downshire ball tonight. Lady Downshire is as determined a matchmaker as my parents. Whomever she means to present to me will no doubt be a pleasant young lady, but I expect my father and mother will have a different candidate from amongst their house guests, whom they mean for me to court. They did last year, and the year before, and the year before that. I am equally amazed, my lord, if I may say so, that none of those young ladies caught your fancy. Your good parents usually have excellent luck." Finished dressing, Percy ran a comb over his thick golden-brown hair, and then stood still while Wilkes brushed him down to eliminate even the slightest idea of lint or hair. "Perhaps I was too young," Percy suggested. "I am 24 now, a good age to marry, I think. I do not wish to wait until I am in my 30s, and then wed someone much younger than myself." Wilkes offered him a handkerchief, a watch and fob, and his quizzing glass. "This may be your year, my lord." "It may be," the Viscount said, lifting his chin a little. "I am game. I want someone intelligent. I do not want a giggly female for a wife. Some of these young ladies just out of the schoolroom make me cringe. They are either giggling, sighing in a dramatic fashion, or simpering like a light skirt." Wilkes lifted an eyebrow. The Viscount flushed. "I beg your pardon, Wilkes. I should not have said that last. Your poor Methodist ears." His valet pressed his lips together. Sighing, Percy added, "Or spoken of young ladies with fine reputations in such a fashion." Wilkes nodded, and began collecting discarded clothing. "Thank you for apologizing, my lord." "You are welcome," Percy said, grinning cheekily. "Are you certain you are ready to wed, my lord?" Percy released a short bark of laughter, took his hat and walking-stick from the dressing-table, and strolled from the room, whistling to himself. Chapter 2. The day of their departure for Castle Omnis arrived with a swiftness that defied belief. Lizzy, Jane, Mary, and Polly climbed into their travelling carriage. The 2 carriage horses stamped their hoofs impatiently. Their father closed the vehicle door himself. Their mother and their 2 other belligerent sisters stood on the steps behind him, variously sniffing and waving handkerchiefs in farewell, glaring at them as though they had personally wrangled the invitation with the sole purpose of keeping their younger sisters at home. "Be good," Mr. Bennet said, grinning at them, "and behave yourselves in a manner befitting your station." "Yes, papa," his daughters said in chorus. He looked at Polly. "I am depending on you to look after my daughters. You are older and presumably wiser than they are. Give sensible counsel." "Yes, sir," Polly said, gulping. A tall, thin woman in her mid-30s. She had been with the family since her youth. Their coachman was her father. Mr. Bennet stared at his daughters. "Listen to Polly's advice, and do not ill-use her." "Papa," Lizzy exclaimed, "we would never abuse her." "Being away from home for 2 solid weeks is not what she is used to," he reminded them. "If you behave sensibly, her job will be so much easier." "Papa," Mary said, sitting on the rear-facing bench next to their maid, "we are cognizant of the honour you have done us by trusting us to represent the family at this house-party. Our behaviour will reflect on the Bennet name, and we will do nothing to besmirch it." "Well said, Mary," Jane said, smiling gently at her. "Now," Mr. Bennet said, nodding at Mary, and then the other sisters, "this is not the lightest carriage, and the horses are not the fastest, so I expect you will get no more than 7 miles an hour out of them. Therefore, Chalfont St. Giles is about 3 hours away. John Coachman knows his craft, so kindly do not urge him to go faster than he believes is best for the horses and the carriage." Jane scooted forward and kissed him on the cheek. "We will manage very well with John and Quinn," she promised, referring to their groom who sat up beside the coachman. "We will bow to their superior knowledge. Do not worry so." Their father sighed and stepped back from the carriage. "Have a wonderful time. Farewell." He nodded to John, who touched his hat-brim and nodded back. The carriage started with a jerk. The ladies settled against the tufted leather seats, reaching for the straps attached to the side walls. "I hope we forgot nothing," Mary said. "I hate having to turn back after we have started a journey." She leaned forward eagerly. "I have brought a book to read aloud if you fancy that." Lizzy grinned. Mary had an excellent reading voice. "What is the book?" "Tales of the Manor by Sarah Green, Volume 1, Mary explained, digging in her capacious reticule. "She wrote the private history of the Court of England." "I remember that. You had best switch places with me if you are to read," Jane offered. "Not you, Jane." Lizzy gestured to Mary. "Switch with me. Jane always becomes ill if she rides backward, and you always get ill if you read from that bench." Once they had settled, with much jostling, into their new spots, Mary opened the book. "I will begin with the introduction," she said. "In one of the pleasantest southern counties in England stood an ancient manor house." They made 3 stops on the way, waiting a quarter of an hour each time for the horses to refresh themselves. Lizzy and her sisters, followed by Polly, strolled around the village where they stopped, stretching their legs before they had to be knocked about in the carriage again. In one village, Mary bought a new black riband for the mourning locket she wore in commemoration of her friend Heather Schofield. Its jet and silver oval frame surrounded a crystal centre containing a swirl of Heather's hair. Lizzy and Jane waited respectfully while Mary changed out the ribbons. Jane tied it back around Mary's neck. Their sister had put aside her mourning clothes as promised, but they believed she would wear that locket for the remainder of her life. "There," Jane said, patting her shoulder. "Shall we get back on the road?" "Do you think we could eat something?" Lizzy asked, looking down the lane at the inn where they had stopped. "A few slices of toast, perhaps, or crumpets and jam. I do not wish to arrive at the castle hungry." Jane and Mary seconded the idea, and they returned to the inn. To Polly, Jane said, "You may order something from the kitchens if you are hungry. We will look after the bill. The same for John and Quinn." Polly curtsied and hurried away. Once in the inn's tiny dining area, set aside for female guests, they ordered some toast and honey. "Tea as well, miss?" the landlady asked, smiling kindly upon them. "I've some fine mint tea that will set your insides at will." "Yes, thank you," Jane said, nodding. A commotion rose in the yard when a fine chaise and pair came to a stop. A tilbury joined it. Lizzy and her sisters glanced out the windows. "Fellow travellers?" Lizzy asked. "We're that popular, miss," the landlady said as she bustled away. The outside door opened, and soon several gentlemen and a lady entered the dining area. Lizzy recognized them immediately, and inwardly groaned because of the sight of 2 of them. "Ah, there you are," Mr. Bingley said, grinning widely with delight. "We have caught you up." They moved to stand, but he waved them back to their seats. He and Mr. Darcy bowed to them, and they bowed their heads back. His sister dropped the hint only of a curtsy. She had dressed in the height of fashion, carrying a white feather muff and a bonnet adorned with a curling white ostrich feather. Her pelisse was of rich burgundy wool, fastened with shiny brass buttons. "Darcy has come, as you see, and Caroline too," Mr. Bingley said, waving to his friend and sister. "May we join you?" "We are glad of your company," Jane said with her usual calm politeness. I did not realize you meant to meet up with us." Lizzy eyed Mr. Darcy askance. When she had learned he meant to be at this house party, she had almost cried off. Only for Jane's sake would she subject herself to the continued presence of the arrogant gentleman who thought himself above his company. Because of him the Meryton Assembly had been a nightmare, while Mr. Bingley had the disposition to enjoy himself in any society. It seemed to Lizzy that his friend did not enjoy the same gift. Pride. His dark gaze met hers, and she lifted her chin in ready defiance. He might prefer not to dance with her, or any other lady he considered beneath his dignity, but she would not allow his prejudice to influence her enjoyment of the fortnight ahead. "Miss Elizabeth," Mr. Darcy said, bringing a chair into the gap between her and Jane. He held it for Miss Bingley, who sat with evident hesitation. "I believe the chair is sturdy enough, Miss Bingley." "But how clean is it?" she asked with a fastidious shudder. Unfortunately, the landlady had followed behind them. Her answer came in clipped, short words. "We cleans them every morning, miss." "Of course you do," Mr. Bingley said, smiling at her. "I saw that immediately." He brought another chair for himself, placing it on Jane's other side. On the way to sitting, he looked around the table. "Where is Darcy?" he asked, standing again and searching the small dining room. "What are you doing over by the window? Come, join us at our table." "The table is already over full," Mr. Darcy stated, his expression aloof. "Nonsense," Mr. Bingley declared. "We will all budge up." He assisted the ladies in moving their chairs an inch or two, leaving a gap between Lizzy and Mary large enough to hold another chair. "There, see? Plenty of room. Bring a seat for yourself." To Lizzy's acute discomfort, she found herself squished between the two persons in the room she disliked. The landlady approached Miss Bingley and stiffly asked, "Can I take your muff, miss?" Miss Bingley reluctantly passed it to her. "Thank you." "I'll put it here, miss," the landlady said, pointing to a polished sideboard. "Pray," Mr. Bingley said, casting a pleading look at his sister before smiling again at the landlady. "Whatever these ladies have ordered, bring for us as well." "We only ordered toast and mint tea, sir," Jane pointed out. "Ah," he said, frowning a little. "Capital. But can you add some cold sliced meat to the order?" "The joint isn't ready yet, sir," the landlady said, her manner softening a little. "We've some small pork pies, if that'd please you." "Excellent," Mr. Bingley praised. "2 half-pints of ale, as well as the tea, please." "Yes, sir," the landlady said, bustling away. Mr. Darcy glanced at each of the Bennet sisters in turn, saying, "I hope you ladies will not object to our drinking in front of you." Miss Bingley replied, "A mere half-pint in an inn will annoy no one." Lizzy bristled at being spoken for. Jane met her angry gaze and gave a tiny shake of her head. Subsiding, Lizzy took a moment to breathe in long, even inhalations. Her ire receded. "I find that method useful as well," Mr. Darcy said softly from beside her. Startled at finding herself so intimately addressed, she turned to look up at him. If it would not have been excessively rude, and if there had been room, she would have scooted her chair away a few inches more. Lizzy inwardly cringed, but managed a nod. "I find it works better for me than counting to 10, she admitted, equally as quietly. Not quietly enough, it seemed, for Mary quoted, "A soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger." To Lizzy's surprise, Mr. Darcy gravely said, "Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1. I like the second verse as well. The tongue of the wise useth knowledge aright, but the mouth of fools poureth out foolishness." Mary lifted her eyebrows. "Verse 7 is like unto that one. and I have never been able to reason out why both are in the chapter." Mr. Darcy said, looking up at the ceiling for a moment as though reading the scriptures there. He quoted the verse, surprising Lizzy again. "The lips of the wise disperse knowledge, but the heart of the foolish doeth not so." You make an excellent observation. Redundancy, do you think? Her sister nodded. "There is much supporting evidence in the scriptures for your hypothesis." "Thank you." "Did you attend Oxford, Mr. Darcy?" Mary asked. He nodded. "What did you read?" "The classic and history." "It is a shame women may not attend," Lizzy observed. "Mary would have taken a first." Mr. Darcy did not mock her observation, not even by the lift of an eyebrow, which further amazed her. Instead, Miss Bingley laughed in a derisive way. "Women at Oxford?" she asked, her lips twisted into an unkind smile. "Where might that happen, Miss Elizabeth? In another world altogether. Oxford has been in place for over 700 years. Will it take another 700 before female students are permitted?" Lizzy raised her eyebrows. "Are you saying it can never happen?" "I am," she stated. "You are exceedingly sure of your opinion, Miss Bingley," Jane mentioned, frowning delicately. "Am I wrong?" Miss Bingley demanded of her fellow diners. "There is no way to know," Jane observed. "Fortunately, women may study in seminaries or in their own homes. I understand there are places in the world where women are taught nothing. Even in England, girls and women must have the permission of their fathers, brothers, or husbands," Mary stated, though not in an accusatory fashion. Her dispassionate words caused a pall to come over their group. Finally, Miss Bingley attempted to give the last words on the subject. "As it should be. We are fortunate indeed to have a father who loves learning, and has permitted his daughters to study whatever they wished," Jane said smoothly. Lizzy had stiffened at Miss Bingley's words, and clenched her hands in her lap. She felt a touch on her fist. Glancing first down at Mr. Darcy's finger, which he immediately withdrew, she next looked up and caught his gaze. The hint of compassion she spied in the depths of his dark brown eyes astonished her so much that her fists relaxed. She tore her gaze away, feeling confused by the feelings churning inside her. Anger was there, and frustration and annoyance, and bewilderment, too. What does he mean by feeling empathy for me? Or was it for all women? Yes, that is it. He has a sister whom he has raised mostly on his own. He feels compassion for the plight of all women because of her. Not for me alone. Assuredly not for me. Lizzy felt relief ease into her, as she understood what she thought his motivations must be. Mr. Bingley had said that Mr. Darcy felt a great deal for his little sister. He worried about her future, for she had a significant dowry that would go to her husband upon her marriage. Seeking to turn the subject, Lizzy asked, "How is your sister, Mr. Darcy?" His eyebrows shot up. "Very well, thank you." "How I long to see her," Miss Bingley cried in a caressing manner. "We do not see enough of her, do we, Charles?" Darcy cringed at the falseness of Miss Bingley's assertions. His friend's sister tried too hard to attach him to her. At least his cousin, Anne de Bourgh, did not chase after him mercilessly. The sooner Miss Bingley married to some other gentleman, the happier he would be. She wished her brother to marry Georgiana, too. That would not happen. He had the greatest regard for Charles, but he did not have the right temperament for his sister. "She will be in town for her presentation at court this spring," Darcy mentioned. "Her birthday is next month, is it not?" Miss Bingley asked archly. "She only wishes to exhibit her intimate knowledge of my family," Darcy thought, inwardly cursing. If only one could have friends without being associated with their sisters. It is. She will be 17. Miss Mary's eyebrows rose. I thought it more common to wait until a young woman was 18 before presenting her at court. Darcy watched Miss Elizabeth open her eyes at her younger sister. Miss Mary shrugged her sister's warning off and looked up at him, clearly waiting for an answer. Possibly, he replied. Appearing unsatisfied with his reply, Miss Mary fixed her attention on Miss Bingley. Were you presented at court? Charles's sister stiffened. I was not. Oh. Miss Mary's frown dissolved. Oh, of course, you did not satisfy the conditions since your father was in industry. Miss Bingley gasped, but Darcy could tell that Miss Mary had meant no malice by her remark. It had simply been a statement of fact. Fortunately for all concerned, their refreshments arrived. Talk turned, then, to the food and their upcoming visit to Castle Omnis. The three sisters looked eagerly out the carriage windows, seeking their first sight of the castle. Immense maples, still gowned in yellow and scarlet leaves, lined the drive that wound around a stand of yew and another of holly. The park opened up and the drive straightened. Lizzy glanced through the rear window to see if the Bingley carriage had made the turn. It had. Mr. Darcy followed in his tilbury. The gentleman had insisted on accompanying them, even though they could have arrived sooner on their own, since their carriages were built for greater speed. "Oh, there it is!" Lizzy exclaimed, pointing. "There are several towers, though one looks too narrow to contain a proper chamber." "I like the crenellations around the larger tower," Mary observed. "I would like to stay in a tower bedchamber." "Do you not worry there will be a ghost?" Jane asked, smiling. Before her sister could reply, she said, "I see the garden is mostly walled in dark pink stone. That wing is made of red brick and grey stone. It must have been built more recently." Lizzy craned her neck to get a better look. Soon they would not be able to see any of it from inside the carriage. "Papa said the original castle was mostly destroyed during the Civil War, and that successive heirs have added on to the Elizabethan wing that remained when Cromwell was defeated." "At least many of the windows are large," Jane said, sitting back. "I am glad we have arrived at last. I am tired of being on the road." "Amen, miss," Polly said, pressing a hand to her chest. "However will I find me way about that place, miss?" Jane gave her a comforting look. "The Earl's servants will help you, I am sure." "If you say so, miss," Polly said, her expression glum. John Coachman drew the carriage to a halt beneath the portico protecting the massive oak entrance doors. Behind them, Mr. Bingley's chaise stopped, and then Mr. Darcy's tilbury. The carriage rocked as Quin jumped down to open the carriage door. He touched a hand to the brim of his hat. "Miss Bennet," he said, lifting his hand in readiness. "I will assist her, thank you," Mr. Bingley said, standing now beside the groom, holding out his hand for Jane to take. "Aye, sir," Quin said. His hand fell to his side, and he stood at attention, staring directly ahead, a wooden expression on his provincial face. "Miss Bennet," Mr. Bingley said, offering his hand. Jane smiled shyly at him and accepted his assistance. The Countess clapped her hands once and made an encompassing gesture. "They are here." "All of them?" Sebastian St. Edmund asked. He stood next to the immense fireplace in the entrance hall, his arms folded and his foot on the fender. "No," Percy answered, joining his mother and father where they stood ready to receive their guests. "Andrew Sprot will not arrive until after dinner." "Sprot," Sebastian said, snorting in derision. "What an unfortunate name." "Behave," the Dowager Countess St. Edmund murmured, flowing over to him. "Are you to have a guest in your tower?" "I better not," he warned with a growl. "I will," she replied smugly. "Miss Elizabeth Bennet." "Quiet, quiet now," the current Earl said in a loud voice. "Banning is opening the door." "We can see that," Sebastian muttered. Banning led 4 ladies and 2 gentlemen into the hall. He stood to one side, saying, "My lord, my lady, may I present Miss Jane Bennet, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, and Miss Mary Bennet of Longbourn House." The 3 sisters curtsied. "And this is Miss Caroline Bingley of Netherfield Park." Caroline Bingley curtsied, smiling her widest, and demurely lowering her eyes. "Welcome, my dears," the current countess said, smiling broadly. "I am Countess St. Edmund. This is my husband, Earl St. Edmund, who knew your father, Miss Bennet. And this is my son, Percival, Viscount Turville. Welcome to Castle Omnis." "Thank you for inviting us, my lady," Miss Bennet said, curtsying again on behalf of the other ladies. "We are pleased you have come," the Earl said. "Banning, present these gentlemen. This is Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy and Mr. Charles Bingley," the butler intoned, bowing. "Ah, Darcy, I remember your father well," the Earl said. "You resemble him. Welcome, Mr. Bingley." The gentleman bowed. That was when Sebastian spotted her. He straightened and took a step forward. "Who is she?" he demanded, not bothering to moderate his voice, for no one but the family would hear him. The Dowager hushed him even so. Sebastian was mistaken in his belief, however. Miss Mary Bennet, who had been looking about her in a dazed, wide-eyed fashion, focused her attention on him. He only noticed her reaction in a peripheral fashion, though, for it was the pretty lady at her side that interested him. Pushing through his relatives with impolite haste, Sebastian arrived at the front of the family group. He heard the Viscount curse beneath his breath as he passed him. "Who are you, miss?" Sebastian demanded, standing with his legs wide and his hands on his hips. Miss Mary backed away a step, but straightened her back, glaring at him. The young woman at her side lifted her chin and stared down her retroussé nose at him. "I am Lady Heather Schofield, and you, sir, are extraordinarily rude," she added, turning her back on him. Mary stared from her dead friend to the angry ghost standing only a few feet away. He was not the only spectre she could see here, for the hall seemed full of them. There were so many, in fact, that her host, the Countess, and her son seemed lost amongst the rest. She looked from the angry ghost to her friend, whose eyes flared and nostrils widened. "Heather is not happy." Mary blinked at her. This had never happened to them before. As far as Mary knew, Heather's slim experience with other ghosts matched her own, for Longbourn House had no resident spirits, well, none before Heather arrived 2 weeks after her death. Neither did any other home they frequented. No ghosts lingered in the public rooms, at least. Even the church they attended had none. Heather did not like to enter the adjacent graveyard, however, but Mary had always assumed the presence of her own grave distressed her. Until Heather's appearance in her life, she had never seen even the hint of a ghostly presence. Now it seemed she could see plenty. Mary glanced over at her hosts, hoping they had not noticed her odd behavior. "They are looking at me." She cleared her countenance of expression. Viscount Percival touched his mother's arm, whispered something to her. She nodded, and he approached their guests. "Ladies," the Countess said, smiling, "may I escort you to your bedchambers, so you might refresh yourselves? The footman will have placed your baggage there already, I believe." She indicated the maids behind them. "Our housekeeper, Mrs. Banning, will show your servants where they will sleep. They will share a room close to your bedchambers, rather than upstairs or downstairs where our servants sleep. This is so they will be near to hand if you should need them." "Thank you, my lady," Jane said in her quiet, gentle manner. Mary stood to one side while her sisters and Miss Bingley passed her. The Countess gave her a significant look, and then bestowed one upon Heather, causing Mary to wince a little. Does that mean she sees Heather too? Before the group of ladies had gone more than a few steps, the handsome Viscount with the astonishingly appealing dimples hurried over to them and addressed the Countess. "Mr. Bingley will enjoy staying in the tower room, mother." He looked back at Bingley. "Will you not, Bingley? I believe I recall you mentioning that before." "By Jove!" Bingley exclaimed, grinning widely. His bright blue eyes sparkled. "Would I just—" The Countess grinned and nodded graciously to Mr. Bingley. To her son she said, "Pray inform Banning of the change." "Yes, mother." Mary's eyes widened when the Viscount's gaze moved from the Countess to meet her eyes. He winked at her, and she swallowed a gasp. The medieval knight shouted his displeasure. "What is this?" the angry ghost growled. "I do not like guests." "It serves you right for being rude," the Viscount whispered, glaring at him now. Mary looked from the Viscount, who stood only a few inches taller than his father, to the objector. In life, the angry ghost appeared to have been a tall, powerfully built man, with a magnificent full beard, moustache, and wavy dark hair that flopped down over his wide brow. Strong eyebrows slashed above his eyes, furrowed into a scowl of awe-inspiring splendor. In death his image appeared less powerful somehow, likely due to the fact that, though fairly solid-looking, he still had the blurring effect of all the other ghosts, including Heather. He turned away and gave every appearance of someone stomping off, but she did not hear any sound coming from his feet, which lessened the effect. Goodness, Heather is scowling, but watching him go. "This way, ladies," the Countess said, indicating the direction they were to go. "Everyone can see me," Heather whispered in Mary's ear, "and there are so many ghosts here." Mary nodded. In a barely there voice she said, "Not everyone." She did not fancy being thought odd because she talked to herself. Everyone was an exaggeration, of course. The St. Edmunds and the other specters saw Heather, but none of the others could. Mary had never mustered enough courage to tell her sisters about how Heather continued to linger on the mortal plane, so she had to mind herself around them as well. The ladies all started up a set of wide granite stairs, carpeted with a central band of blue and green plaid. Examples of armour from different centuries adorned the stone walls, interspersed with colourful heraldic banners. "Your bedchambers are in the Elizabethan wing," Lady St. Edmund said to them, turning right when they reached the next floor. "Miss Bennet and Miss Elizabeth will have the two bedchambers across the corridor from yours, Miss Mary. There is a small room between theirs where the Bennets and Miss Bingley's maids will sleep. Miss Bingley, however, will have the bedchamber to the left of yours, Miss Mary, as you face your doors from the corridor." She stopped and indicated a door. Opening it and standing out of the way, she said, "Miss Bingley, I hope you will be comfortable here. This was, I should say, my husband's great-great-great-grandmother's bedchamber." "Thank you. I am certain I shall," Miss Bingley said, nodding graciously to the Countess and walking past her through the door. Mary peeked around her sisters into the rose and green bedchamber. spying a lady wearing a dark gold silk robe battant from the beginning of the last century, standing in the middle of the room. She had her hands folded in front of her, and looked both delighted and anxious at the same time. The ghost curtsied, as though welcoming Miss Bingley. Mary just caught herself before curtsying back. "Is that another Lady St. Edmund?" Heather asked in studied nonchalance. Chapter 3. In a tight whisper, barely louder than a breath, Mary glanced her way and answered, "I believe so." Returning her gaze to the others, Mary discovered the Countess staring at her. Mary ducked her head in confusion and turned away, for such attention was beyond her understanding. No one ever noticed her. Heather remained her only close friend. Remained? For how long? "What is wrong?" Heather asked. "Is it the Countess? Do not be shy with her. I like her." Mary scrutinized her friend. She raised her eyebrows in a silent question, and Heather nodded in a reassuring manner, smiling. They left Miss Bingley in her bedchamber, attended by her maid, and followed the Countess across the corridor. She opened a door and gestured to Jane. "I hope you like this pale blue chamber, Miss Bennet." Jane smiled in her kind way. "I am certain I shall, my lady. This was my husband's great-grandmother's room. She preferred to look out over the front drive, you see, because she liked to keep an eye on the comings and goings of those in her household." Mary searched for evidence of a ghostly presence. As she suspected, a female awaited, wearing a white wig, a huge mob cap, and a dove-grey gown of the style of the mid-18th century. A multi-strand pearl choker adorned her long neck. The lady lifted a lorgnette and stared through it at Jane. Jane entered, her hands going to the ties of her bonnet as she walked. She almost passed through the spectre, who hastily scooted out of the way. Mary thought she saw Jane shiver. A fire had been lit in the grate, and Jane headed for it. Polly scurried from the entrance of the small room beside Jane's, and followed the oldest Bennet sister into the large bedchamber. She closed Jane's door behind her. "As you saw, that is the door to the maid's bedchamber," Countess St. Edmund said, pointing in a decidedly graceful manner toward the simple door. She continued a few steps and opened another door, revealing a chamber made up in beige and gold. "This room, Miss Elizabeth, belonged to the Dowager Countess St. Edmund, my husband's mother." No longer surprised to see a spectral hostess, Mary spied the lady waiting next to the tester bed, her proud countenance wreathed in welcoming smiles. Her rose-coloured gown indicated she must have died near the turn of the century. "It is a beautiful room," Lizzy praised, smiling with obvious delight. "She moved to this room after I married the Earl," the Countess said. "The decoration of the room is entirely of her own design." "The late Countess had excellent taste," Lizzy remarked. "When should we come downstairs again?" "We are gathering in the back parlour in an hour for some tea and biscuits. A footman will come to escort you there." The Countess waved back down the corridor at the other two doors. "I forgot to tell your sister and Miss Bingley. Will you inform them for me?" "I will be delighted," Lizzy said, smiling genially. "Thank you," the Countess said, nodding and turning to Mary. "Now, your bedchamber is right across here," she said, leading the way. Lizzy's door closed behind them. As soon as it did, the Countess stopped, turned to face Mary, and said, "Kindly introduce me to your friend, my dear." Mary gulped. "Yes, my lady." Heather, who had been holding back a little, out of the way of the living, approached, her bearing that of someone who knows her own worth. "May I present my dearest friend, Lady Heather Schofield, who died of typhus. Lady Heather, this is Countess St. Edmund, our hostess." Heather curtsied. "My lady." The Countess inclined her head. "Your father is the Earl of Schofield, is he not?" "Yes, my lady." "I have met him, I believe, at an assembly in Bath." "He is fond of taking the waters there," Heather explained. "He prefers them to the waters in Harrogate." Countess St. Edmund sniffed. "No one likes the waters in Harrogate. They smell like rotten eggs." "They do," Heather agreed. The Countess led them to their bedchamber. "Miss Mary, I assume from your reaction in the entrance hall that you can see any ghost, not just your friend?" "I can," Mary admitted, "though I did not know it before today." The Countess paused with her hand resting on the doorknob. "You did not see them as a child?" "I did not." Interesting." She opened the door and entered a bedchamber decorated with mauve and cream paisley prints, and walls papered with palm tree motifs. A cream-coloured silk coverlet adorned the large tester bed, hung with paisley curtains. "Please, come in," the Countess said, gesturing graciously. She had stopped beside an imposing female spectre, dressed in a gown of the late 18th century. The tall lady looked down her Roman nose at Mary, and then switched her regard to Heather. "I did not know I was to share my bedchamber with two young ladies," the ghost said, smiling stiffly. "Neither did I, aunt. Kindly allow me to present Lady Heather Schofield and Miss Mary Bennet," Lady St. Edmund said. Mary and Heather curtsied. "Ladies, this is my husband's great-great-aunt, Lady Aurelia St. Edmund. She never married, choosing to remain here until her death in 1763. In a trenchant voice, the old lady ghost said, "Enough of that, Sarah. Ladies, I am delighted to meet you both, and to have you as guests in my bedchamber." "Thank you, my lady," Mary said, curtsying again in a self-conscious way. She licked her lips. "I feel as though we are intruding on your peace." "Nonsense," Lady Aurelia said. She grinned. "With you two, I believe I have won the best prize at the county fair." Lizzy undid the ribbons from her bonnet, and pulled out a hatpin. Once she had placed her headwear on the dresser, Lizzy removed her coat. She hung this on a hook behind the door. "Well," she said softly to herself, "my first house party. How odd that we know almost everyone in attendance. Mr. Darcy," she thought with an annoyed mental sigh. "Why does he have to be here?" Her expression altered to one of pleasure. "At least Mr. Bingley and Jane will have time to get to know each other better. He will continue to fall under her spell, I am certain." Lizzy went to the wide window and looked out on the gently rolling countryside. Shaved lawn stretched to a ha-ha wall, the top of which she could barely notice since it blended in nicely with the grass. Her father had urged her to notice this feature of the garden. They had no ha-has at Longbourn, much to her father's disappointment. Their land did not lend itself to the design where the ground on the other side of the ha-ha wall sunk significantly, keeping livestock out of the pleasure part of the grounds. The remarkable design, her father explained, had been brought to England from France in the 1700s. "Why does Mr. Darcy have to be so handsome?" Lizzy muttered, annoyed with herself for even noticing his appearance. "It is easy to be handsome when you are rich," she accused, then clucked her tongue again. "That is not true at all. Why did I say that? The man is driving me mad." Abandoning the lovely view, she went to the washstand and cleaned her hands and face. Next she unpacked, since Polly might not get to the chore before Lizzy needed to change. She shook out a champagne-coloured evening gown and set it on the bed in preparation. "Oh, yes," Lizzy whispered, remembering the task set for her by Lady St. Edmund. "I must tell the others we are expected to gather downstairs." Turning to the door, she discovered that her coat had fallen off the hook. She shook her head at herself for not hanging the coat properly, picked it up off the carpet, put it back in place, and left to seek out Miss Bingley and Jane. Miss Bingley's maid answered the door and curtsied. "It's Miss Elizabeth, miss," she said to her mistress, turning slightly so she could watch for a signal from Miss Bingley. After receiving a nod, she opened the door further, saying, "Please to come in, miss." "Thank you," Lizzy said, smiling and lifting an eyebrow in inquiry at the squarely built woman of about 40 years of age. She must have been with Miss Bingley for many years to be such a country-looking personal maid. I thought Miss Bingley would have a fancy dresser instead. A French refugee, perhaps? "I'm called Tweedy, miss." "Thank you, Tweedy," Lizzy said, entering. She glanced around before looking at Miss Bingley, who stood beside the washstand. "What a lovely room!" "It is it not?" Miss Bingley set down the washing-cloth and picked up the towel to pat her face dry. "Did you merely wish to see my bedchamber, or was there something else? Lady St. Edmund charged me with telling you and Jane that we are to meet downstairs in an hour for tea and biscuits. A footman will come and guide us there." "We will need to change swiftly, then," Miss Bingley said. "The green-striped dress, Tweedy." Lizzy realized she was expected to leave, so she did. What an unpleasant woman. Does she wish to make no friends in Hertfordshire? Perhaps she thinks to marry before she notices the lack of friends in her own neighbourhood. Another thought occurred to her. Or is it fear? But what does Miss Bingley fear from me, or from any of us? Knocking on Jane's door, she shook the thought of Miss Bingley's social affairs out of her mind. She opened the door a little. "May I enter?" she asked. "Are you decent, or will I expose you to every guest and ghost out here in the corridor?" Lizzy heard Jane chuckle, and opened the door just wide enough to slip through into the room. She closed it after her. "Are there any guests or ghosts in the corridor?" Jane asked, only partially dressed in a fresh petticoat. The sisters had learned to dress quickly so they might more efficiently share a single maid. "No guests, but there may be ghosts," Lizzy quipped. "I would not know." She went to Polly, who held Jane's gown and took it from her. "You may go to Miss Mary now, Polly," Jane said, smiling at their maid. "Miss Lizzy will finish assisting me." Polly curtsied and hurried out. Jane watched her close the door. She frowned. "I pray Polly realized you were jesting. She is superstitious, as you know." Lizzy grinned. "I will not be surprised to learn there is at least one ghost in this old pile. In the tower, no doubt." "With Mr. Bingley?" Jane asked, her lovely hazel-green eyes round. "I think he will be disappointed if there are none." Lizzy approached her with the pale azure gown, marked by 3 narrow rows of dark azure ruching around the base of the skirt. "Do you not think so?" Jane's smile returned. "He will be delighted beyond measure if a ghost is present. We shall discover the truth of it at breakfast tomorrow, I suppose, if a phantasm keeps him awake in the night." Lizzy held the gown out so Jane could step into it while resting a hand on her shoulder to steady herself. "I do like Mr. Bingley, Jane dear, and will be delighted to call him brother when the time comes." "It may not come." Her sister pulled up her dress and frowned at her. "May I confess something dreadful to you?" Lizzy began closing the tapes of her bodice. "Certainly. I am beginning to wonder if Miss Bingley may be our enemy in this. Mr. Bingley and mine, I mean." Lizzy sighed. I have told you often that she wishes her brother to marry someone with a fortune or with status. But you have not listened to my warnings, determined to think the best of Bingley's sister. What has altered your thinking on this matter?" Jane seemed to ponder her question, her gaze reflective. "When we arrived here, we were introduced first, as though superior in consequence to Miss Bingley." "Well, we are," Lizzy remarked simply. Her sister sighed. "I suppose that is partially true, depending on the value one places on money and respectability. The Bingleys were highly regarded in their own county. One cannot discount that when measuring their consequence. And they have money and we do not. I think Miss Bingley views her situation as superior to ours in every way. She gave me such a look. I felt my soul shrivel a little." "Dramatically spoken, dearest," Lizzy said, smiling. Jane returned a crooked grin. "Miss Caroline Bingley may think anything she wishes, but our father is a gentleman, and her father was not. We are equally as respectable in our neighbourhood." She held up a hand, her palm toward Jane. "I mean no disrespect toward Mr. Bingley, I promise you." "Mamma is merely the daughter of an attorney." "Very true, but for whatever reason, the status of the male is seen as more significant. Papa is a gentleman, and the former Mr. Bingley was not. Therefore, in the eyes of much of society, we outrank them." In a dry voice she added, "Servants always seem to know these things. Money is not as important to them as breeding." Jane chuckled. "Indeed. I collect that means Polly will sit above Miss Bingley's maid in the servants' hall? Her name is Tweedy. Is it? A North Country name, I suppose? Presumably." Lizzy waved her toward the dressing-table chair. "Sit, and I will refresh your hair. Then you will be ready and can help me." Jane obeyed. Soon they removed to Lizzy's room. "This is striking," Jane remarked, examining the space. Seemingly out of nowhere, she said, "I think Miss Bingley is interested in Mr. Darcy." Lizzy, in the process of hanging up her coat, again, turned her head and looked at her. "Is she? I have seen no evidence of his regard for her. But then he is cold and proud." "Proud? Perhaps, but I do not think him cold. Mr. Bingley counts him an excellent friend. Your Mr. Bingley is inclined to like everyone." Lizzy glared at her coat. There seemed to be no good reason for it to keep falling. If it happened again, she would have to abandon the use of the hook, and have Polly find a place for the garment. "I think," Jane began slowly, moving to assist Lizzy in removing her travelling gown, "that Mr. Darcy holds you in high regard." Lizzy felt an odd lurching in her chest. She blinked at her sister. "Why-ever for?" "I was told he admires your energetic interests and your keen mind." "Keen mind? Energetic interests? I suppose he prefers women who are active, and not fade-away damsels who are subject to vapours and megrims." "Your eyes sparkle after you have had a good long walk. I have often observed it." Jane set aside the dress and reached for the one lying on the bed. "I have always liked this gown on you." "Thank you." Lizzy stepped into it. Jane assisted her in pulling the gown up over her petticoats and into place. "Mr. Bingley told me Mr. Darcy thinks you have a fine set of eyes," Jane revealed, helping her fasten the gown. Lizzy's lips twitched. "You are making that up. He thought me merely tolerable at the Meryton Assembly." Jane's lips compressed.